So this is so exciting. We've got the quilt all pin basted. They're approximately 4 inches apart, all the pins, to hold it nice and flat. So I'm actually going to free motion stitch mine, but a lot of it could be done with a walking foot. I'm going to outline inside both sides of the narrow stripe borders, and I'm going to outline the giraffe, and then I'm probably going to do some wiggly straight lines around in that border and some more straightish, but again I'll be doing the more free motion in this border, and then I'll probably just do something completely free motion in the outside border. So I'll show you what I'm doing as I go through. As I said, you could use a walking foot. Personally, I prefer to use the free motion. I feel more in control, and I feel that things ease in a little bit more comfortably that way. So I'll show you as we go along. So I've been quite busy doing some of the outline stitching. I like to do these straight lines that I'm going to do first. All the straight line work that I've done actually by free motion but couldn't be done with a walking foot. I like to do all that first because then that kind of isolates the areas, so then I can work within this area without fear of it moving. And now that I've also done all the striped borders, just about 1/8 of an inch inside each one, either side, and now I can come back and I can actually do any of these borders pretty much in any order I like because I've isolated the areas with those straight ones. So I've just outlined the giraffe again approximately 1/8 of an inch away, but I feel that this segment is going to need a little bit more quilting, so I'm going to come back and do some more lines in there. Otherwise it's just going to be a little bit too blousy. You want a fairly even amount of quilting throughout your quilt, otherwise things can get a little bit bumpy here and there, which isn't always such a good look. And I'm going to come and do this border, and so it goes on. But by doing those isolating lines first, that gives you a lot more freedom to think about, well, what will I do in this border now, because you've already got its parameters set. So that's always a good idea to do something like that. So I'm just going to free motion some wiggly lines in this border, and I thought that might look quite nice. So I've done the center line already, and now I'm going to do one either side of that, sort of centering it within the space. So these lines, whilst the overall line is parallel, the wiggles are not parallel, they're just wiggly. So I just wiggle the fabric from side to side as I go. So I've been all around one side of each of these squares on point here, and I'm coming about 1/4 of an inch in from the seam, and now I'm coming around again doing the other half. So I've already been out that side, and now I'm doing this half, and then I'm just coming through the points and then continuing on around, and I can go all the way around doing it like that. get to the corner square, I've already gone around the outside of the square, but I haven't finished off the other part here. But I thought that the square needed a little bit more than just the edging on this one because it's a bit larger. So I'm going to just mark more or less where the center is of that square with a little dot, and I'm just going to come onto the square, and then I'm going to make a sort of a 4-petal flower type shape. So I'm going to do a curve around and come through that dot that I marked, and then come back out to the halfway along this line, and then come back, making the curve go the other way and arriving back at the starting point. And then I'm going to go along that 1/4 inch in and back up to this one, ready to go along the next line of squares. But now I want to do my other shape here, so I'm just going to do that before I go any further. So that's kind of fun, flattens the square a little bit more interesting, and then I'm ready to come up this side. So in this outside border, I've just decided I'm just going to do a fairly large meander. It's kind of a meandering jungle, so I thought we could meander stitch all over it. So exciting. I finished the quilting. We've got some meandering behind the giraffe, we've got some wiggly lines along this border, we've got some what appear to be zigzaggy lines around these squares and inside the squares, and we've got some more meandering out here on the outside border. So it's all looking pretty good, everything looks fairly evenly spread. So I'm going to go ahead and trim off all my edges, level with the top border here, and then I'll come back and show you how I'm doing the binding. Very often when I'm trimming things that have got batting like this, I turn my cutting board over to the wrong side, so that if any little bits of batting did happen to get stuck in the board, which can happen sometimes, and they can be scrubbed out, but I kind of think that this is quite good to use the back of the board because often we use one side and not the other. So I use the back of the board very often when I'm trimming away things, particularly if they've got the batting in them, because the batting little fibres can get caught in the little cutting lines in the board. Even though it's a self-healing mat, sometimes those fibres get in the way. So there, it's now all trimmed and looking ready for its binding. So I have the binding here. The pattern suggested that we cut some 2.5 inch strips, which I've done, and I've joined them up, and I have tried to match my stripes on the joins, but it hasn't worked particularly well every time. But for me that doesn't really present much of a problem because it's just such a small amount and it doesn't really show when you do the binding. However, if you're using a stripe and you need it to match, then you have to just try a little bit harder than I did. So I'm all ready to do the binding. I'm going to machine my binding on front and back. So I like to start off, I like mine to sit flat. And I fold it over as I go. Some people like to press their bindings first. And I like to start off with a folded corner. So I fold that corner over so that the raw edges are level. and I bring it up level to the edge of the quilt, and I just start sewing from that point on the binding. And just to pretty much to where the end of that folded corner is, I stop there and take that out. I like to just get rid of these little threads that hang around. So now I'm going to fold that edge over, and I'm going to leave a couple of inches before I start sewing. I've got all the raw edges even, and I'm just going to start having left a gap there which will allow us to tuck in the other end when we come round to the other end. So I'm just using my 1/4 inch seam allowance here. I've got the raw edges of the binding together and the raw edges together with the raw edges of the quilt, and I'm just going to stitch all the way around, but I'll show you how I do the corners when I get there. Now, one thing, when you put a binding on, you want to add just a tiny bit of tension. You don't want to make it really tight and pull on the binding too hard, because that will bunch up the edges. But if you don't add just a little bit of tension, your bindings can sit just a little bit wavy. So you just a slight bit of firmness, not too much. So I'm coming up to a corner now, and when I come up to the corner, I'm going to stop sewing 1/4 inch before I get to the end of the actual quilt, and just finish off with a little back stitch. So you may want to mark that. You may want to put a pin in. You might know where that is on you. If you're using a 1/4 inch foot like I am here, there's a little groove that shows you where 1/4 inch is ahead of where the needle is, and that's a really handy little thing as well. So I can see that I'm pretty much there now, so I'm just going to do a little back stitch, and I like to take that out at this stage. And again, keeping the raw edges of the binding together, I fold that out so that it's nice and straight here, and this should be following through the corner here where we stopped our stitching, and then I'm going to fold that back down again so that the fold is now level with the edge of the quilt, and again the raw edges are level at this end. And I'm going to turn the quilt around, and I'm just going to start sewing right from the end there and continue on. What this does is it gives us a little fold which will allow us to have a nice mitre when we turn the corners over to the other side of the quilt. And then I'm going to continue on all the way around the quilt, stopping at the corners, doing exactly the same thing each corner, and then I'll show you how I tuck in the end when I get back to the beginning with that little bit that we started with. So here I am, just about back at the beginning where I did that little fold over starting point, and I'll just show you how I tuck that little corner in. So come and sew pretty much up as far as the point itself. The point's just sitting underneath there. And then I'm just going to trim away. So I've left a little gap here to tuck that into, so I'm just going to trim that away so that it's shorter than the space that I've left, so that it will tuck inside there. So I'm going to tuck that right in there, keep it nice and firm, and bring this folded bit back up again. It doesn't really matter if a little bit of the binding that you've just tucked in sits out, as long as you're keeping the sewing straight, because we can trim all that off. So there we are back at the beginning. If there's a little bit sticking out here, we can just trim that away. We don't need that to sit there, it just makes it a little bit bulky. And there we've got our binding, it's nicely tucked in. Now I should have mentioned earlier, if you wanted to hand stitch your binding down, you would have done all the stitching that I've just done onto the front of the quilt, and you would be rolling it to the back of the quilt. But I'm going to machine mine, so I'm going to roll it to the front of the quilt. It doesn't really matter where you start at this stage. because everything's enclosed. That little join that we've made is a self-closing little folded over little piece there. So I'm going to just start here so that I can show you one at the corners, so that you can see how they all sit in nicely together now that we've done those funny little foldy bits that we did there. So I'll just start down here near the corner. So I'm going to roll that right around all those raw edges so that it sits nicely on the front, and I'm going to just start stitching that down. So I'm stitching fairly close to that folded edge that we've rolled over, and it's going to most likely create a second line of stitching on the back. You may find that there's a tiny line of stitching there, but in general it's not something that ever notices, and it certainly doesn't bother me to have that line of stitching on the back. So I'm not trying to match up the exact edge here. I'm going a little bit past where we sewed the binding on. So we're coming up to the corner here. And so to make these nice little miters, let that fold come straight through, and then we're just going to lift that folded bit over so that it sits nicely in the corner there. Now you could pop a pin in there if you wanted to hold that while you come up to it. And then once you've got that needle in it, you can pivot that around and start sewing. Now I tend to just do a little back stitch here for no particularly good reason. I just think it helps the corners sit nicely, and then go all the way along and stop and do exactly the same thing at the next corner and all the other corners. So you can see that we've ended up with a very nice little mitered corner just there. So this is pretty exciting. We've finished the quilt. How about that? The binding's on, we've got some nice little mitered corners, we've got a nice quilt. These fabrics are absolutely delicious. These are a small range of fabrics by Nutex in New Zealand, and they're called In the Jungle, and we've teamed them up with some stripes and some dots, which has just worked so nicely. We've got these wonderful giraffes, and we've appliqued a giraffe to go in there because of course this is the jungle giraffe quilt, and they're just delicious. So if you're interested in the pattern is available from my website to purchase and download from GourmetQuilter.com. The pattern is called Jungle Giraffe, and it's using wonderful fabrics by Nutex. Now I should mention one other thing. I've also put another one of their delicious fabrics on the back as well. I thought that dot was just wonderful. And when you're doing your quilt, don't forget to pop a label of some sort on. Now I've actually chosen to put in some of the selvages from each of the fabrics that I've used, because I kind of like to know what's in there, and I think that's a good way to use some of the selvages. I've also got a small piece of label here that I've printed myself with my name on it. When you're labeling your quilts, if you've made it as a gift, it's nice to say who the quilt's for, who the quilt was made by, and if there's any other relevant information, you might want to put some care instructions on. But it's a nice idea to have a label on a quilt. Sometimes we like to name our quilts, as well as the people they're for and from, etc. So there's lots of information you can put on the label on a quilt. It doesn't even have to go on the back, but often it is on the back. So there we have it, Jungle Giraffe, and the pattern's available from GourmetQuilter.com. I hope you've enjoyed making it as much as I have. Thank you.